Hey Ableton friends, I've got a new Max for Live device that I'd like to show you, and it's called GMaudio Fusion. What it does is it allows you to take an input from anywhere in your live set and combine it with the audio that is passing through the device to generate new sounds. How it combines the two signals is all based around arithmetic. So it's using the numerical value of the signal and then applying some sort of math and outputting the result. So it's an unapologetically digital distortion. And it can get pretty nasty, but there's lots of interesting textures there to be explored. So I'll just give you a brief demonstration with a really simple input first, and then we'll look at some more complex examples. Here I've set up an instrument rack which has two wavetable instruments. And I've just set up some macros so that I can kind of move through the wavetable on each of these instruments. And these are essentially going to drive Fusion. So one of them is going to be the Y input and one of them is going to be the X input. So you can see here on Fusion that for input Y, I've selected the instrument rack. And then in this second drop-down menu, I've selected the Y input. So I could grab the audio from different points of that track, but the most common one you're going to grab is post effects. That way you can have the actual audio muted and just be listening to the two sounds combined. Cool, so let's have a listen to how this sounds. I'm just playing the note C, quite a low C, but let's hear how these sounds these two sine waves sound combined. Cool, so not much happening there. I can just adjust the dry wet so we can hear the difference. That's definitely a sine wave. And then turning the dry wet up, we can hear those two sine waves being combined. But it really just sounds a bit distorted. So there's not a whole lot happening there at the moment because we have two sine waves that are playing the same pitch that are perfectly in phase, or very close to perfectly in phase. So the values between the two signals aren't very different. Let's try a different mode. To describe these modes, fission will divide the two signals and then output the remainder, otherwise known as modulo in programming language and in Max language. This one, split, is basically going to give you the top half of the waveform of one and the bottom half of the waveform of the other, and combine those to create a new kind of wave shape. Splice will allow one signal to pass when the other one is above 0. So it's kind of like a gate, switching a signal on and off, but it's happening at audio rate, so it can create some pretty interesting kind of tones and shapes and distortions. Then there's extract, which takes one signal away from the other, but to make it kind of different, one of the signals, it's using its absolute value, which means just its positive value, and for the other, it's using its full bipolar value for the amplitude that it would generally use if it was being sent to a speaker. And in doing that, we can use this input switch, which will change which signal is kind of the modulator and the carrier. They're always kind of combining, and there's not really ever one that is being modulated by the other. They're both modulating each other. But having that absolute value for a couple of these modes allows us to change the tonality by switching between which input is input X and which input is input Y. So that's what this does. It's either X times Y or Y times X, for example. Cool. So let's have a listen to each of these modes. Fission. So with both those sine waves being exactly the same, you can hear that that has no effect because there's no difference between the two signals to create that unique distortion. So just by having a little bit of detune, or by changing the wave shape, so getting some pretty interesting waveforms there. And that's probably something that you wouldn't get from other types of distortion. So it is quite a unique effect. And you'll see that there's a bunch of different uses for it. So I'll quickly go through all of these modes and then we'll jump to some examples. So there you can see that the top half is kind of a saw wave and the bottom half is the sine. We can use split, and maybe if we detune these oscillators away from each other. Splice looks pretty interesting. So that's the one that at audio rate will gate the incoming signal. Then extract. So that's taking one away from the other. There's some interesting stuff there, but again, if I detune this, it's kind of interesting. Yeah, that's nice. I like that. So we're getting these weird modulations as well as new kind of shapes. And then the last one, divide. So if I just turn the dry wet down and then turn it back up, so that's just with really simple sounds going in, and that can be quite interesting, just combining simple sounds and playing with pitch and seeing how that interacts with the two waveforms as they go in and out of phase. So let's bump up the complexity a little bit and actually use this to feed back on itself. So on this track, I'm using GMaudio Fusion just to grab the audio from this track and route it to this one here. So by having the mode set to off, and then having this input switch set to YX means that it's treating the Y input like the X input, and it's just going to output it with no processing. So in this state, it's just grabbing the audio from track 2 in my live set. And then I've got a low pass filter with a bit of resonance and a frequency shifter, just doing a little bit of stereo modulation. And then another fusion, which is taking the audio from itself. So this is basically feeding back the output of track 2, going through a filter and frequency shifter back into itself and combining those two while switching the modes and the input switches. So let's hear how that sounds. And obviously any changes we do here is going to affect that. So I'll just play the two sounds together now, the original and this kind of weird feedback sound. So lots of fun to be had there. And that's just with very simple sounds and using some feedback or feeding Fusion back on itself. So now let's have a look at using some more complex signals. So this is a pretty busy project that's got a few sounds, but some pretty complex routing and loads of Max for Live. So first, let's just focus on this particular sound. And if we have a listen, and I'll just turn off GMaudio Fusion for now so we can hear the original signal. So I've just got analog running through my FM FX device and an LFO controlling the amount, giving this kind of very techno stab type sound. And that's also running through a sweeping notch filter, an echo, some compression and distortion. So that all sounds good, but if we throw GMaudio Fusion in the mix, then we can modulate the amplitude of that signal via an external source. So in this case, I'm using an operator, which has just got a little bit of FM going on, and I've detuned it, and I've also chosen a slightly different waveform, so it's not a sine wave. But basically, we've got a relatively simple sound going into a relatively complex sound. So let's hear the result. So I'll just dial back the dry wet. That's the original. That's the new sound. So by giving it a stereo signal that is the quote unquote modulator, that is essentially turning this mono signal into a stereo one, because the fusion effect is a stereo effect. So it's going to work on both left and right channels independently. So that sounds pretty cool. And when we change the modulator anyway, that's going to change the output of Fusion. So it can get pretty gnarly there, as you can hear, with two little bit more complex signals. So that's one of the sounds I've got in this project. I'll show you some of the others. So this one is just a drone that's been created by feeding a bit of crackle into a resonant filter, which is going into a wave folder, which is being modulated by a Max for Live LFO, followed by FMFX, which is being modulated by an LFO, and then Fusion, which is having its mode modulated. And there's also a sweeping notch, limiter, bandpass filter, and more effects. So quite a bit happening. And as you can see, I'm using the Live 11 beta, and this is the little CPU usage meter. So this is the most CPU intense track in this project. So that's the one showing all the CPU usage here. So let's hear how that sounds. So that's with Fusion disabled. And if I turn it on, so I've got the sound feeding back on itself using Fusion, and it kind of cuts in and out because some of these modes need to see certain levels for them to work correctly. So by modulating the mode, it's kind of cutting that sound in and out because there isn't quite enough volume to continue that feedback into the use of that particular mode. But I actually quite like when you switch these modes quickly, sometimes there's enough signal to just keep that feedback going. And you can hear that the input switch has a slight effect on this as well. So this is quite a subtle thing. And really, I think that's the way to use GMaudio Fusion, is just using it subtly throughout a project to give some very interesting distortions. Because I think the beauty of this device is in its subtleties. So trying to make the most of those little imperfections, I think, is going to yield the best result. But I'm very keen to see how other people use the device. So on this one, I've got collision, which is being modulated quite a bit, and I'll just turn Fusion off, and you can hear this. So kind of rhythmic percussion type thing. And for this one, I'm using another track over here, which I've called noises, and that is the quote-unquote modulator. And it's pretty much just like touching the end of a audio connection. And I'm using that as the modulator for this percussive instrument. So let's see how that sounds. So with it off, so you can hear the remnants of those two sounds, which is quite interesting. I've also got GMaudio Universe on there, giving it some stereo width because it's mono sound. And yeah, just a bit of delays, EQ, stuff like that to make it a little bit more interesting. Then the last sound is just analog, playing a chord, going into GMaudio Universe and an echo to create a kind of dubstep. And this time I'm just using Fusion feeding back on itself. So I've set the dry wet to 50%, which allows some of the signal to pass through and this feedback to work correctly in this mode. So if you're using it to create feedback and you're not getting any level, try dropping the dry wet back from 100% to something like 80% or 50%. And that will allow some of the signal to still pass through while still feeding back. Because at 100%, it might be that the output is muted briefly, which then mutes feeding back of the audio signal. So having that 50% will just ensure that the feedback can occur on some of these modes. Cool, so let's have a listen to that. So very dirty. With it off, with it on. We can listen to these other modes. We can switch between modulator and carrier. And you can hear very quickly that it feeds back. So be careful. So now, what does all this sound like combined? And then turning Fusion on and off for all of the instruments. So I'll turn it off and we can listen to everything. And then I'll turn Fusion on. And off. So definitely makes this live set a little bit more interesting with those distortions in there and gives it a unique kind of flavor. And you can create some very interesting interactions between these sounds using GMaudio Fusion that are going to change as the sounds change. So let's have a look at some other examples. So this example is even more complex again. Basically, what I started with was just a recording of my vocals. So me just doing some oohs and ahs, a little bit pitchy at the end there, but I used that in a bunch of simplers to create all the sounds that you hear in this project. So every sound is created from that one recording that I did here. And if we have a listen. So as you can hear, lots of interesting sounds in there, and that's all created from my voice. So it goes to show that it's not what you have, it's how you use it. So let's break down a little bit of what's happening inside this project. So the first one, I'll just focus on this bass. So I'm using quite a lot of random and probability to create this ever-evolving soundscape that's being generated. And this project, even though it has very few tracks, actually uses loads of CPU, which means that I would need to resample this if I wanted to turn it into a complete track because of all the modulation and randomization, and yeah, there's lots going on. So this bass instrument is an instrument rack, which is got a simpler and my voice in there, and I've just looped a small section, basically using that like a wavetable, and then I'm beefing that up with an operator, just adding a little bit of sub to that bass and pronouncing the fundamental. And I'll turn Fusion off and you can hear what's going on. So it's quite a simple sound. This isn't too interesting, but once I add Fusion, it definitely does get more interesting. And the way that I'm using it is I'm just feeding this chain of the instrument rack back into itself. So the sub is being left untouched. So the distortion is only being applied to my voice, which I'm using as an oscillator, but the fundamental is still being emphasized using this operator, just playing a sine wave with a few extra harmonics. So if I mute that, turn Fusion on. Then add the operator. It's just implying that fundamental a little bit more. The other stuff that's making this sound a bit more interesting is definitely my GMaudio Universe effect that's adding some kind of chorus to it. So makes it very wide, very stereo, very cool. And yeah, there's a bunch of effects kind of really squishing the sound together in the typical OTT style, and also doing a little bit of side chaining. Instead using a high pass filter to side chain rather than using side chain compression. Something that I recommend people explore a little bit more, because I think it's a much more interesting way of side chaining basses to drums. And here at the end is a new device that I've been working on that I'm just going to tease now briefly. It's a very interesting compressor that uses a unique detection algorithm to create the envelope that it uses for the compression curve. And it also listens to the project tempo and uses the BPM to calculate attack and release times. And it's also got a clipper that I'm experimenting with that I've programmed in C, in Gen, in Max to clip the output, so that way when you really drive the signal into this compressor, some of the sound that still reaches past the compressor gets clipped, so you can really smash sounds through this and get a really punchy, interesting sound. So it's definitely got a character, and there's still a bit of work to go, but yeah, I just wanted to tease that, and you'll hear it on some of the other tracks in this project as well. So let's have a look at this drums group. Now I've got the main drums, and I've got a bit of a pattern happening there, but on top of that pattern, I've got an arpeggiator with some random that is going to randomly select different drums on top of that. And I've got some note probability on the kick and snare. So that's kind of generating this slightly random drum pattern. So that's with Fusion off. So you can clearly hear GMaudio Devolve Dramatics kind of really pushing the sound and making it heavy. With it off. With it on. So that's adding quite a lot of character to the sound. And what I've got going on here is I've got basically a copy of that main drums track, but instead the drum rhythm is being generated by this Max for Live device. And I've also got, again, another bit of random MIDI being generated by this MIDI effect rack with some probability. And that is going through another Max for Live device, which is really awesome, called Fragulator. And I think that's from the old Pluggo for Live pack. So it's a free pack from the Ableton store. And that's being modulated a lot. So nearly every parameter is being modulated. And I've got a little rack that I made for that you may have seen in some other videos. So that's really glitching out these drums. So with that on. And then once I add Fusion in here, Fusion is being used to feed back that sound on itself. So let's have a listen. So I really like how that sounds. And I'm also adding a bit of that into the main drums. So we've got these glitchy drums and the main drums, which are less glitchy, being fused together, or has this kind of weird feedback path going on between them. So that's cool if we listen to just those. So you can hear the effect of the GMaudio drum limiter here. Really cool device, and yeah, you'll hear more about that later. This is also a device that I'll be giving away for free. It's basically an emulation of the BBE Sonic Enhancer. It's very approximate, and it was just a bit of fun really, but it actually does sound quite good. You'll hear more about that later as well. Cool, so the last thing I wanted to show you was this audio effect rack, which I'll include in the download of this device. So in this example, I'm just using this instance of GMaudio Fusion to grab the audio from this track labeled main drums, and I'm grabbing it post effects, so that way when I solo this track, we're still hearing this even though it's been muted. So if we had it set to post mixer, then because we have this soloed, you wouldn't be able to hear this. So when I hit play, you'll hear that it's just the drums coming through. So how you would use this audio effect rack would be, you would set input Y for both this Z output chain and the Y input chain. So the Z output is basically where the distortion is going to take place in this chain here. So for the input Y, I've set to the bass, and then also on this Y input chain, I've set the input to the bass. And then this one where it says X input, I don't need to do anything. This is already set to off. So basically what this is doing is just allowing the audio to pass through, because X isn't being multiplied by anything. It's just coming straight out of the output. Once that's set up, you've set your input Y for this Y input and for the Z input. Then you'll be able to blend from the X input, which is the audio running through the rack, to the Z result or output, basically the distortion that is generated by GMaudio Fusion, and then to the Y signal, the secondary input that you've selected using the little drop-down menu. So how that's done is I've used the chain selector and these fades on all these chains to blend between all those signals. So you can see starting off at the X input and then blending into the Z output and then into the Y input. And I'm also controlling some volumes inside GMaudio Fusion of this Z output as well. And that just helps blend everything a little bit more. So this will be a rack that will be included with the download. And yeah, it's just another way to use GMaudio Fusion in more of an arrangement sense rather than just a purely sound design situation. So you could use it to, in a very distorted, unique way, blend between two sounds, either very slowly or, quite quickly. So I'm just going to demonstrate this briefly, but I'd be really interested to hear what other people do with this rack and this device in general. But let's just hear how this morph sounds. So going from the X input into that mix between X and Y, which is the Z output, until we reach just the Z output, and then blending out of that into just the bass. So that's kind of interesting. We can choose some different modes. So got a macro here that will switch the mode. Let's try this one. just a few little examples there with two sounds, and it's obviously going to sound very different with your own two signals. So another thing to explore there. As always, any questions about anything in this video, just drop a comment. I hope I haven't made this video too long. I did actually make a full-length video like this for GMaudio Universe, but I haven't edited it yet, and I've got lots of ideas for new videos. I'd especially like to do some live videos about my live performance rig that I put together over the last 3 weeks and then performed with recently. So I'd like to explore that with people watching. I think that could be interesting. Also, I've got updates coming to GMaudio Noisia, the dynamic EQ, and I've got a couple other free devices, as well as some new mixing tools and some other projects which I've kind of slowly getting around to finishing. But basically, lots of stuff to keep you guys inspired and making cool music. So please subscribe and hit the little bell so that way you get notifications when I upload new videos. And it'd be great to have you guys interact with me with some live videos as well. So thanks for watching, everyone. Go grab GMaudio Fusion. It's only $5 Australian. And in doing that, it allows me to spend more time making cool stuff for you guys to use. And see you next time.